what I did here was a series of studies to develop a way to try to prevent the risk of shallow water diving spinal cord injury. In Australia, spinal cord injury across the world contributes around about 70% is contributed by sport and recreation. 70% of sport and recreation injuries are as a result of aquatic injuries. So most people who have a spinal injury as a result of their recreation activities, it comes from being making contact with the bottom or an upslope in an aquatic setting. Usually it's with the bottom, but sometimes it's with the upslope going towards the shallow end of the pool, or it might be a submerged tree in a river that the diver's head makes contact with. The typical person injured is an athletic male, 15 to 29 years of age. Active people who have a whole lot of their life still to contribute. Their diving skills are typically self-taught. No one taught them how to dive, and they say they're unaware of the dangers associated with diving into shallow water, and they don't know about the skills required to perform a low-risk entry. They never would have dived in on that occasion if they knew the consequence was that the rest of their life they were going to have a spinal cord injury. So they're not stupid, they don't mean to have the injury, but they're not prepared with the skills to try to prevent that injury. And depending on which literature you read, alcohol is involved in somewhere between 30 and 70% of cases. In Australia, it's about 10% of admissions to our spinal units come from aquatic activities. And if we talk about tetraplegia or quadriplegia, it's 20% of the cases. The number is small, although I'll go back to what Polo said this morning. The official numbers of the 13 to 27 doesn't take into account people who drowned who weren't recognised to have had a spinal injury. So they drowned because they couldn't roll over and take a breath because they'd suffered the spinal cord injury. The average of the last 5 years of available data from Australia is about 25 people per year. So it's not a huge number, but I'd like you to reflect for a moment. I'd like you to close your eyes for a minute. Please don't fall asleep. I know I'm a presenter before lunch, but I want you to think about what you're doing on the weekend and what you're doing in a month's time, and maybe where you're going over your Christmas break. And now I want you to think about what the difference would be if you had a tetraplegic injury. And it's a completely different world. Financial burden is significant, both for the person and for the state, who hopefully help to support this person. I have experience of being involved in a number of court cases in Australia where where expert reports are required. The last one that I was involved with, the settlement was $6 million. I wouldn't take that $6 million for what that person had to go through to be in need of that money. Okay, so what happens? The head stops, the body keeps going. So you can see on the right-hand side of that page, you can see what that's doing to the neck. We've measured the velocity at impact, or at the maximum depth, on about 400 dive entries. And every single one of those dive entries, the velocity is sufficient to dislocate the cervical spine, and in 98% of them, sufficient to crush cervical spine. So I guess what we can say there is that every single dive entry has the potential to cause a spinal cord injury. Typically the injury is at C5 or C6, and typically there's no injury on the head. There's no blood on the forehead or anything like that, but the neck has been broken. Mechanism is vertical compression and flexion with rotation, and as I said before, there's emotional devastation associated with it and the significant financial costs. I need to thank one of my students for this slide, which I really love. It wasn't an aquatic spinal cord injury. He actually went over the handlebars of his mountain bike when he was riding in the forest, and he said to me afterwards, "I thought of you at the time," and I said to my mate, "Don't touch me." Since that injury, so the injury is on the left-hand side and the stabilisation is on the right, he's done the Hawaiian Ironman as an able-bodied person, so that he survived that without any consequence. But he said it was the involvement he'd had in the aquatic stuff that he had done with me that encouraged him to stop his mate touching him so that he could be extracted from the forest appropriately without exacerbating the injury. This is a great slide that I use with my university students. You can drop a pin in the room when they get to see the difference between those two slides. Okay, for a number of years we've talked about prevention, but talking about prevention isn't enough. This gentleman here was at a site where we were visiting because a spinal injury had occurred from exactly that spot. So the rather large rock that you can see, just the second rock from the front, the second big flat rock, is referred to the dive rock at this site. That sign that you can just see, the post that you can just see there, it's a light post, but it has signs on it. On one side it says no diving. Clearly it's not adhered to. On the other side, interestingly, it says strictly no fishing. So clearly the consequence from fishing must be more severe than the consequence from diving. And you can see in the young man who's diving there, he doesn't have his arms out at the front of him, making the situation much more dangerous. Okay, so what did I do to try to prevent this? I used a health promotion framework, the PRECEDE-PROCEED Framework, to situate the study that I did, to try to make it as scientifically robust as possible, to make sure we weren't missing anything, and we worked through this framework in the development and the delivery of the research study. I hope to have time to go back to this framework, but if I don't, I've included at the back of the presentation this slide with arrows to indicate which part of this research project is matched with which part of the PRECEDE framework. So, as I said, hopefully we'll have time, but we might not. Okay, so for successful prevention, we need awareness, and that's a promotion aspect. But I come from a physical education, exercise science background, and I know about curriculum and skills, and that's an area that we really wanted to investigate. And ideally, we also want some public policy and regulation change. But I'm going to talk about the curriculum and skills component now. We did a series of studies. I'm going to talk about study 1 at the moment, but you can see that this whole project had a number of stages to it. In the first stage, we wanted to characterise what the elements were that distinguished a low-risk dive from a higher risk dive in that young adult population that's at risk. So we filmed 112, I think it was, of my first year university students diving in to swim. They didn't know we were filming their dive. I told them that we were going to film their swimming. I told them afterwards, and I did get that through our ethics committee, so the deception was allowed. But the reason for that was that when somebody dives in and has an injury, they weren't thinking about diving in and having an injury. I didn't want my participants to change their entry because they were thinking about they knew that we were looking at the entry. I mentioned before about having an on-deck coach background, so I have worked with swimmers significantly, both in the learn to swim setting and in the competitive swimming setting. As a competitive coach, I was really surprised to see these recreational swimmers allow their hams to separate or to do something that vaguely resembled a breaststroke arm action when they started when they entered the water before they reached maximum depth. So they permitted their hands to separate, or they did a breaststroke-like arm action. It was deep, And we did 4 different dive conditions. We did a dive to tread water, dive in, talk to your mates, mess around in the water. That was from deck level. A dive from deck level to swim a lap. A dive from deck level to... Oh, my video started. Whoops.
2 or 3.
Oh, that's okay. All right, I'm going to stop it right there because I think it will go... I'll start it again in a minute. But and deck level, block level, and for those who are comfortable to do so, a running dive entry. So I think you've seen all 4 of those dives, and you can see that the varying depths that people went to. I think that one was my most favourite, which was serendipity in research. Was that the one where the poor young man lost his bathers? Yes. So you'll see how what he did there was... Oh, they're going to run through again. He clearly took his hands away. So mums, don't tell your kids to pull their bathers up until they surface. So you can see how they're entering the water without reaching maximum depth without having their head protected, and in that case certainly without protection for the head as they reach maximum depth. So from that we decided there were things that we needed to do or there were things that we could target to make things safer. First of all, it was to get our learners to lock their hands together and lock their head in position so that it didn't move. One of the spine surgeons who we showed that footage to indicated when he watched the footage, he was saying, they're not keeping their head in that position. So it's kind of like when people dive in and say to their mates, hey, look at me, and it puts their neck in a position where the vertebrae aren't protecting the spinal cord as best they could. So locking hands, locking head, and steering up upon entry so that they come to the surface quickly. We then use those characteristics to develop a teaching sequence to teach. We taught all of those students, but then we filmed the 34 worst of them after the intervention. So we did 7 10-minute sessions talking about keeping the hands locked, the arms extended. We did lots of underwater gliding and steering skills. So they're body orientation things. They got to feel what they were doing with their body. And that helped them to develop those steering up skills. We did some diving progressions. We filmed them immediately after the 7 10-minute sessions, and then we filmed them 8 months later and 20 months further again. So that was kind of like 2 seasons, 2 summers later. And we found that their skills were improved. They were retained after 8 months and they were retained after 20 months without any further practice. So we were confident that the techniques that we were using were making a change and that the skills that they had were retained. All of these steps have been published in the peer-reviewed literature, and I can provide those references should anybody want them. Okay, so the sort of things that we did, there's our steering up. We did gliding through hoops. We did up and over noodles, coming up through hoops, so that they were developing those body orientation skills. We found that the horizontal velocity, the distance that people could get through the air before they entered the water was really vital to minimising the depth that people went to. So we really wanted to get that horizontal push to get horizontal flight. So we worked a lot on that pushing off the wall from a seated dive, and then making sure that their toes were curled over the edge when they went to their crouched and standing dives, so that they, even if the surface was wet and their foot started to slip, they were getting that push against the wall to get that flight. The less flight they got, the steeper they went, so we wanted to extend that flight. We also put soft mats in there to get them to dive over the soft mats to increase their flight distance. Okay, I mentioned the fact that we looked at retention and that they did safely, retain the skills well. And you'll see here, this was one of my poorest swimmers at the beginning, and you can see how that's 2 metres deep. So he loses his goggles, he goes right down and touches the 2 metre bottom. Here he is afterwards, same swimmer. You can tell he's a recreational swimmer and not a competitive swimmer because he's in his shorts, doesn't own a pair of Speedos, but he clearly showed the progressions that were achieved, the advance that was achieved. So our takeaway message from that, first of all, diving is only one way to enter the water. We always want people to check the water before they perform a dive entry. We need to make sure we include those safer skills in a Learn to Swim curriculum and revise those skills, highlighting the lock hands, lock head and steer up, and making sure that people use these skills in every head first entry. If we can teach them when children are young, before they're at that at-risk age where the spinal injuries occur, it's kind of like the habit of putting your seatbelt on. You don't have to think about it, you just do it when you get in the car. Same way, if you can just get into the habit that every entry you do this, you don't think, oh gosh, it's a bit shallow, I must be careful. Hopefully that young adult male who's had a few beers will automatically do this. If he hits his hands on the bottom and he breaks his wrists, we don't really mind. That's much better than hitting his head on the bottom and breaking his neck. And they've got that reminder there about every dive entry having the potential to cause a spinal injury. Okay, so we went through that, we showed that it worked. Now I want to talk very briefly about how we can use that to change practice. And I'm going to apologise to you. I did have an already scanned copy of the old book. I haven't scanned my new one, so my picture here has the old book in it. But these are some of the ways that we translated it into the real world setting. So if we look at the two that I have circled there, this is the regulatory approach. So the guidelines to safe pool operations, and the second one, which might be a little bit more difficult to read, is the New South Wales Ministry of Education guidelines that every New South Wales public school student, government school student, has to go through that before being involved in competition, in a school competition. And every public pool has to have gone through that before having any schools having competitions at their pool. The AusSwim textbook for teachers of swimming includes a chapter on safer diving skills that uses our progressions that I wrote because AusSwim supported our research. It was a stakeholder we worked with. And so that gets to every person who does the AusSwim Teacher of Swimming course in Australia to become a teacher. And education and promotion within the handbook, or now within drowning, because we have a chapter in there to talk about that and to direct people to further information. So for promotion, remind people that every dive has the potential to result in spinal cord injury. Highlight checking the depth and making sure the area is free of obstacles. Use that lock hands, lock head, steer up slogan. Remind people that feet first entry is using their head. And target children before they're at-risk youth, parents, coaches, lifeguards, pool managers, teachers, and run media campaigns. Skill development, I mentioned acquiring the skills before we reach the at-risk age. The same slogans, the same information that we require in awareness can be developed through skill development. And changing it into practice with regard to policy, working with stakeholders such as the deliverers of teaching curriculum for Learn to Swim, education departments, bodies such as the Royal Lifesaving Society, and competitive swimming bodies with regard to pool depth requirements. So in conclusion, diving is a high-risk activity, but we can mitigate that risk by using that multifaceted approach, using awareness, skills and policy with an evidence base behind it and changing the practice in the real world, which hopefully will lead us to successful, safer entries. As I said, I have got the framework from the PRECEDE-PROCEED model. as the next slides if anybody wants to have a look at those at a later stage. And I have the reference for that PRECEDE-PROCEED model as well. Thank you.